The envelope hit the marble table with a sound that shattered Jasmine's world into 1,000 pieces. She stood frozen in the center of the grand living room, her hand instinctively moving to cradle her barely visible baby bump as her husband of 3 years stared at her with eyes colder than the December wind howling outside their penthouse window. "Sign them," Damien said, his voice stripped of every warm memory they'd ever shared, every whispered promise in the dark, every vow he'd made before God and 200 witnesses at their lavish wedding. The divorce papers sprawled across the glass surface like accusations, each word a dagger aimed at her heart. If you're watching this, hit that subscribe button because what happens next will leave you speechless. And trust me, you don't want to miss how this story of betrayal, secrets, and ultimate revenge unfolds. Jasmine's fingers trembled as she picked up the documents, her eyes scanning words that made no sense, even as they burned into her brain. Irreconcilable differences, immediate dissolution of marriage, relinquishment of all claims to assets and properties. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Not tonight. Not on their 3rd wedding anniversary, the same night she'd planned to surprise him with the sonogram photos pocked in her purse. The same night she'd bought his favorite cologne and made reservations at the restaurant where he'd first told her he loved her. Her throat tightened as she looked up at the man she'd built her entire world around, searching desperately for some sign of the Damien she knew, the one who used to trace patterns on her skin and call her his queen, his everything, his forever. But that man was gone, replaced by this stranger in a $15,000 suit who couldn't even meet her eyes as he destroyed everything they'd built together. The diamond anniversary band she'd bought him sat in a velvet box on the kitchen counter. Forgotten now, meaningless, just like their marriage apparently was to him. "Diamond baby, what are you talking about?" Jasmine's voice cracked, tears already streaming down her face, ruining the makeup she'd so carefully applied earlier that evening, when she still believed this night would end in celebration rather than devastation. She took a step toward him, reaching out with the hand not clutching the papers. But he moved back as if her touch would burn him, as if the woman carrying his child was suddenly toxic, contaminated, unworthy of his presence. "We can talk about this. Whatever's wrong, we can fix it. I love you. We're having a baby. Damien, our baby." The words tumbled out in a desperate rush, each one a plea for him to wake up from whatever nightmare had possessed him, to remember who they were to each other, to remember the countless nights he'd held her and sworn nothing would ever come between them. But Damien's jaw only tightened, his hand adjusting the Rolex on his wrist in that gesture she'd learned meant he'd already made up his mind about something and no amount of reasoning would change it. "There's nothing to fix, Jasmine. This marriage was a mistake from the beginning. I was young, stupid, thought I knew what I wanted. But I've grown now. I've evolved. And you?" He paused, his eyes finally meeting hers with a contempt that physically hurt. "You're exactly where you were 3 years ago. Still simple, still small-minded, still beneath the level I've reached in my life and career." Each word landed like a physical blow, and Jasmine actually stumbled backward, her free hand gripping the edge of the couch to keep from falling as the room spun around her and the baby she carried seemed to grow heavier with the weight of rejection. The man she loved, the father of her unborn child, was looking at her like she was nothing, like their 3 years together meant absolutely nothing at all. The front door opened with a click, that sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence. And Damon's mother, Patricia Wellington, swept into the room like a queen surveying her conquered territory, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor with the rhythm of a funeral march. She'd let herself in with the key Damon had given her against Jasmine's protest. The same key she'd been using for months now to invade their home whenever she pleased, treating Jasmine like an unwelcome guest in her own house. "Oh good," you told her, Patricia said, her voice dripping with satisfaction as she set her Hermes bag on the console table and removed her leather gloves with deliberate slowness, making a show of her victory. "I was worried you'd gotten cold feet, darling. Men often do when it comes to necessary decisions, especially when dealing with women who've trapped them." Her eyes slid to Jasmine with unconcealed disgust, lingering on her stomach with the kind of revulsion usually reserved for roadkill. "Did you really think it would last, girl? Did you honestly believe my son, a billionaire who built an empire from nothing, would stay tied to someone like you, a nobody from nowhere with no pedigree, no connections, no value beyond a pretty face that's already starting to fade?" Jasmine's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms as she fought the urge to scream, to throw something, to make these people feel even a fraction of the pain tearing through her chest. She'd endured 3 years of Patricia's subtle and not so subtle insults, 3 years of being called unworthy, uncultured, unsuitable for the Wellington name. But she'd stayed silent because Damon had asked her to, had promised it would get better, had sworn his mother would eventually come around. Now she understood the truth. His mother had won, and Jasmine had lost everything. "Diamond, tell me she's lying," Jasmine whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her heart shattering into smaller and smaller pieces. With each passing second of his silence, she searched his face for any sign of the man who proposed to her on a beach at sunset, who'd cried when she walked down the aisle, who'd promised to protect her from anything and anyone who tried to hurt her. "Tell me this isn't about her. Tell me you're not doing this because your mother wants you to. You promised me, Damien. You promised no one would come between us. You stood in front of everyone we know, and you promised." But even as she spoke, she could see the truth written in the way he avoided her gaze, the way his shoulders straightened when his mother placed a possessive hand on his arm, the way he transformed from her husband into Patricia's obedient son right before her eyes. "My mother has nothing to do with this," Damien said, but the lie was so transparent, Jasmine almost laughed through her tears. "This is my decision. I've outgrown you, Jasmine. My company has tripled in value this year. I'm meeting with senators, closing deals with Fortune 500 CEOs, building an empire that will last generations. And you? You spend your days shopping with my money and gossiping with your little friends. You bring nothing to my table. You're dead weight, and I'm cutting you loose before you drag me down any further." The cruelty in his words, the practiced nature of them, told Jasmine he'd rehearsed this speech, probably with his mother coaching him, probably while she'd been at home planning their anniversary dinner like a fool. She wanted to scream that she'd given up her own career aspirations to support his, that she'd distanced herself from friends and family because they weren't good enough for the Wellingtons, that she'd molded herself into exactly what he claimed to want. But the words died in her throat. "There's someone else, isn't there?" The question fell from Jasmine's lips before she could stop it, and she watched something flicker in Damon's eyes, something that might have been guilt if you're still capable of such an emotion. "That's what this is really about. You found someone your mother approves of, someone worthy of the great Wellington name." She laughed, A broken, bitter sound that didn't even sound like her own voice anymore. Who is she, Damon? One of those society girls your mother's always pushing at you. Someone with a trust fund and the right last name. Someone who knows which fork to use at those boring charity dinners and doesn't embarrass you by actually having a personality. For a moment, just a heartbeat, she thought she saw him flinch, thought she saw a crack in the armor he'd wrapped around himself. But then Patricia spoke again, her voice sharp as a blade. Her name is Nicole, and she's everything you're not, dear. Educated, refined, and most importantly, she understands what it means to be a part of the Wellington legacy. She works as Damon's executive assistant at his office, so she actually contributes to his success instead of leeching off it like some people. The older woman's smiles were this pure venom as she continued, clearly enjoying every second of Jasmine's humiliation. In fact, you're invited to their wedding next month. Damon insisted. He wants you to see what a real partnership looks like, what he could have had all along if he hadn't made the mistake of marrying you. Consider it his wedding gift to you, a final lesson in knowing your place. Jasmine's vision blurred, her knees finally giving out as she sank onto the couch, the divorce papers fluttering from her hands to scatter across the floor like the remains of her shattered dreams, and somewhere in the chaos of her breaking heart, a small voice whispered that this was only the beginning of her nightmare. Don't click away now, because what Jasmine does next will shock everyone, including Damon and his cruel mother. Make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell, because next chapter reveals secrets that will change everything you think you know about. 3 days had passed since the divorce papers landed on that marble table. 3 days since Jasmine's world collapsed. And now she stood in the bedroom she'd shared with Damon, watching his mother direct 2 security guards as they packed her belongings into cardboard boxes with all the care of someone disposing of trash. Patricia had wasted no time executing what she probably considered the final phase of removing Jasmine from her son's life, showing up at 8 in the morning with a moving crew and an eviction notice that somehow Damon's lawyers had managed to push through with terrifying speed. You have 2 hours to gather your personal items, Patricia had announced from the doorway, not even bothering to step fully into the room, as if being in Jasmine's presence might contaminate her perfectly pressed Chanel suit. Anything you don't take will be donated or destroyed. Damon has been more than generous, allowing you to stay here these past few days. But his patience, like mine, has run out. The words still echoed in Jasmine's head as she watched array the silk nightgown Damon had bought her last Valentine's Day, folding it without ceremony before tossing it into a box marked simply clothing. If you're still watching, make sure to like this video and drop a comment telling me what you would do in Jasmine's situation, because what's coming next is going to blow your mind. She wanted to scream, to fight, to refuse to leave the home she decorated with such care, choosing every throw pillow and art piece to create a sanctuary for the family she dreamed of building. But the security guard's presence made it clear she had no choice, no power, no rights in this place that had never really been hers at all. The jury stays, Patricia announced suddenly, her sharp eyes catching the way Jasmine's hand moved instinctively to the diamond necklace around her neck. The one Damon had given her on their first anniversary. The one she'd worn every single day since, because it made her feel close to him, even when his business trips kept them apart. All gifts purchased during the marriage are considered marital assets, which means they belong to my son, not to you. Take it off. The command was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who'd been waiting for this moment, who'd spent 3 years watching Jasmine wear Wellington diamonds and counting down the days until she could strip them away. Jasmine's fingers trembled as they moved to the clasp, but something inside her, some small spark of defiance that hadn't been completely extinguished, made her pause. "Zamon gave this to me," she said quietly, her voice stronger than she felt. "He said it was mine forever, that it symbolized his eternal love." Are you saying his word means nothing? Are you admitting that every promise your son made was a lie? For a second, she saw Patricia's composed mask slip, saw something ugly flash across the older woman's face before she regained control. "My son's word is gold in the business world, girl, which is something you'd understand if you had even a basic education in how real success works. But when it comes to mistakes, even the best men are allowed to correct course. The necklace. Now. Or I'll have security remove it for you, and I promise they won't be gentle about it." The threat hung in the air like poison, and Jasmine knew Patricia meant every word, knew this woman would take pleasure in having her physically restrained and stripped of anything that connected her to the Wellington name. The necklace came off with a soft click, and Jasmine placed it carefully on the dresser, refusing to hand it directly to Patricia, refusing to give her that satisfaction, even as everything else was being taken from her. She watched the older woman scoop it up with greedy fingers, examining it like she was checking to make sure Jasmine hadn't damaged it somehow before dropping it into her designer purse, alongside her phone and car key. "The wedding rings too," Patricia added, her eyes dropping to Jasmine's left hand, where the 3-carat diamond engagement ring and platinum wedding band still sat. The only pieces of her marriage she had left now that Damien himself had abandoned her. Those are family heirlooms, not gifts for temporary wives. "My grandmother wore that engagement ring, and it will go to Nicole now, to someone who actually deserves to carry on the Wellington tradition." The casual way she said it, the ease with which she erased Jasmine's entire existence in this family, made something crack inside Jasmine's chest. She twisted the rings off her finger, the skin beneath them pale and indented from 3 years of never taking them off, even to shower, even to sleep, because they meant everything to her, even when apparently they meant nothing to Damien. "Here," Jasmine said, holding them out, her hand remarkably steady considering the storm raging inside her. "Take them. Take everything. Strip this place clean of any sign I was ever here. Erase me from your precious family history. But you should know something, Patricia." She waited until the older woman's fingers closed around the rings before continuing, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Your son didn't just break my heart. He killed something in me that can never be brought back to life. And one day, when he realizes what he's lost, when your perfect Nicole shows him who she really is, he's going to look for me and find nothing but empty space where I used to be." Patricia laughed, actually laughed, the sound harsh and mocking, as she dropped the rings into her purse with the necklace, probably already planning which jewelry cleaner should take them to, which appraiser should have verified their value before passing them on to her son's new bride. "Oh, sweetie, you really don't understand how this works, do you? Damien isn't going to come looking for you. Men like my son don't look backward. They only move forward toward bigger deals, better opportunities, more suitable partners. You were a phase, a brief lapse in judgment that he's already forgotten about. In 6 months, he won't even remember your name." She gestured to the boxes stacked by the door, most of them only half full, because Jasmine had come into this marriage with so little and had been discouraged from buying anything for herself during it. "This is all you are, all you'll ever be. A few boxes of cheap clothes and cheaper memories. Now get out of my son's house before I have you arrested for trespassing. The security guards moved closer, their hands resting on their belts in a clear warning, and Jasmine knew her time was up, knew that staying even one more minute would only lead to more humiliation, more pain, more proof that she was utterly powerless in the face of Wellington money and influence. She grabbed her purse, the one personal item she'd been clutching since this nightmare began, and walked toward the door with her head held as high as she could manage, refusing to let Patricia see her crumble, even though every step felt like walking through broken glass. But as she reached the threshold, she turned back one last time, her eyes scanning the bedroom where she'd laughed and cried and made love and dreamed of the future. Memorizing it before it was wiped clean of her existence forever. "You haven't won," Jasmine said softly, one hand resting on her stomach, where Damien's baby grew. The only piece of this marriage she'd get to keep. The only thing they couldn't take from her, no matter how hard they tried. "You think you've destroyed me, think you've put me back in my place, but you have no idea who I really am. You never bothered to ask, never cared to find out, because I wasn't worth your time. That was your first mistake, Patricia. Your second mistake was teaching your son that love is conditional, that people are disposable, that money and status matter more than character and loyalty." She saw the guards exchange glances, saw Patricia's face darken with rage, but Jasmine kept talking, the words flowing out of her like water from a broken dam. "When you see me again, and trust me, you will see me again, you're going to wish you treated me with even a shred of human decency. You're going to wish you'd asked questions instead of making assumptions. You're going to wish a lot of things, but mostly you're going to wish you'd never underestimated me." Before Patricia could respond, before the security guards could grab her, Jasmine turned and walked out of the penthouse, her cheap sneakers squeaking on the marble floors that had never really been hers, past the art she'd chosen and the furniture she'd arranged, through the door that locked behind her with a finality that felt like a coffin closing. She made it to the elevator, pressed the button for the ground floor, and waited until the doors slid shut, and she was alone in the small space before she finally let herself fall apart, sliding down the mirrored wall to sit on the floor as sobs tore from her throat, each one carrying away another piece of the woman she'd been, the wife she tried so hard to be, the future she believed in with her whole heart. And in that moment, Jasmine Monroe Wellington realized she had a choice to make. Let this destruction define her forever, or rise from these ashes into something they could never imagine, never predict, never control. What happens when Jasmine makes that choice? Next chapter is going to show you a side of this story you never saw coming. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the next chapter reveals the truth about who Jasmine really is. And trust me, Damien and his mother are not ready for what's about to hit them. The phone rang exactly 7 times before her father answered. And Jasmine sat in the cramped hotel room she'd checked into with the last of her personal savings, staring at the peeling wallpaper and water-stained ceiling that was such a far cry from the penthouse she'd left behind that morning that it felt like she'd fallen into a different dimension entirely. "Jasmine," Robert Monroe's voice came through the speaker, warm and concerned in a way that made her throat tighten with fresh tears. "Baby girl, I've been waiting for your call. Are you safe? Are you okay? Tell me where you are, and I'll send a car right now." She'd been avoiding this conversation for 3 days, avoiding it because calling her father meant admitting that her marriage had failed, that Damien had thrown her away like garbage, that she'd been too proud and too stubborn to listen when her family had warned her about getting involved with someone from the Wellington family's world. Make sure you're subscribed, because what gets revealed in this chapter is going to change everything you thought you knew about the story, and you don't want to miss a single second. "Dad," Jasmine whispered, her voice breaking on that single syllable. "I need to come home. Damien served me with divorce papers on our anniversary. His mother had me thrown out of the penthouse this morning. I don't have anywhere else to go." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity before her father spoke again. And this time, his voice was different, harder, carrying an edge of steel she'd only heard a handful of times in her life when someone had made the mistake of threatening his family. "That boy and his mother have made the biggest mistake of their lives," Robert said quietly, each word measured and deliberate. "Stay where you are, Jasmine. Don't move. Don't talk to anyone. I'm sending my security team to get you within the hour, and then we're going to have a conversation that's 3 years overdue." The black SUVs arrived 53 minutes later, pulling up in front of the rundown hotel, with a precision that made the desk clerk's eyes widen and the other guests stare through the grimy windows, probably wondering what kind of person staying in a $40 a night room wanted that level of security detail. Jasmine watched from her second-floor window as 6 men in dark suits emerged, moving with the kind of coordinated efficiency that spoke of military training, and she recognized the lead man immediately. Somos, her father's head of security, who taught her to throw a punch when she was 12 and had checked under her bed for monsters when she was 6. He looked up at her window as if he could feel her watching, nodded once, and she knew without a doubt that her father had told him everything, had probably given explicit instructions about how to handle this extraction, because Robert Monroe didn't do anything halfway. She grabbed the single duffel bag she'd managed to pack before Patricia's guards had thrown her out, took one last look at the depressing room that had been her refuge for less than 24 hours, and headed downstairs to face whatever came next. Thomas met her at the bottom of the stairs, his expression neutral but his eyes kind, and when he spoke his voice was gentle despite his imposing presence. "Miss Monroe," he said, using her maiden name deliberately, "your father is waiting. We'll get your things loaded and have you home in 30 minutes. No one will bother you again, I promise you that." The other guest watched as she was escorted out like royalty, probably thinking she was a celebrity or a criminal, having no idea that she was neither and both, just a pregnant woman whose world had shattered and who was finally going back to the people who actually loved her. The drive to her father's estate took them through parts of the city Jasmine hadn't seen in 3 years, past the neighborhood where she'd grown up, through streets she'd walked as a teenager, dreaming of a future that looked nothing like the present she was living now. She'd stayed away from her family at Damien's request, or rather at his mother's insistence, filtered through Damien's mouth, because Patricia had made it clear that Jasmine's background was an embarrassment, that her family's wealth was new money and therefore worthless, that maintaining distance was necessary if Jasmine wanted to be accepted into proper society. What a fool she'd been, believing that cutting ties with the people who genuinely cared about her would somehow make the Wellingtons love her, would somehow transform her into the daughter-in-law Patricia wanted. The SUV turned onto a private road, passed through gates that opened automatically, and Jasmine felt something in her chest loosen as her father's mansion came into view, sprawling and elegant, but warm in a way the Wellington penthouse had never been, with lights blazing from every window like a beacon calling her home. The house had been built by her grandfather, expanded by her father, and was filled with 3 generations of Monroe family memories, success, and most importantly, love. She'd forgotten how much she'd missed it, how much she'd sacrificed trying to fit into a world that never wanted her in the first place. Thomas opened her door and helped her out, his hand steady under her elbow as she stood on shaking legs, and then the front door burst open and her father was there, running down the steps with none of the dignity a man of his position should maintain, and Jasmine broke, absolutely broke, running into his arms like she was 6 years old again, and he was the only person in the world who could make everything better. "I've got you, baby girl," Robert murmured into her hair as she sobbed against his chest, his arms wrapped around her with the fierce protectiveness of a man who'd moved mountains for his daughter before. "I would do it again without hesitation. I've got you, and I'm never letting anyone hurt you like this again. Never." He held her until the tears slowed, until she could breathe again without feeling like her lungs were full of broken glass. And then he guided her inside where her mother waited, where her younger brother stood with fury in his eyes, where the family she'd neglected for 3 years welcomed her back without a single word of reproach or judgment. They settled in her father's study, the same room where he'd built his empire from nothing, where he taught Jasmine about business and strategy and the importance of knowing your worth. And as she sat in the leather chair across from his desk, she noticed for the first time the Forbes magazine on the side table, the one with her father's face on the cover, the headline reading, "Robert Monroe, the trillionaire nobody talks about." Her breath caught because she'd forgotten, had actually let herself forget in her desperation to become a Wellington, that her own father was richer than Damon could ever dream of being, that the Monroe family wealth made the Wellington billions look like pocket change, that she'd walked away from an empire to marry into what amounted to a kingdom when she'd been a princess all along. "Dad," she started, but he held up a hand, his expression serious in a way that made her straighten in her chair, suddenly aware that this conversation was going to be different from any they'd had before. "3 years ago, you asked me not to interfere in your marriage," Robert began, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of something dangerous, something that reminded Jasmine that her father hadn't built his fortune by being nice or playing fair, that he was a businessman first and a gentle parent second. And right now, she was seeing the side of him that made competitors tremble. "You said you loved Damon Wellington, that you wanted to make it work on your own terms, without your family's money or influence. I respected that decision, even though every instinct I had screamed at me to run a full background check on that boy and his poisonous mother. I stepped back. I let you grow. I watched you cut ties with us because his family demanded it. Watched you shrink yourself down to fit into their narrow little world. Watched you lose the fire that made you my daughter. And I kept my mouth shut because you asked me to, because I trusted you to come back when you were ready." He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk between them, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her unable to look away. "But now you're here, pregnant with his child, thrown out like trash, served with divorce papers on your anniversary. And you need to understand something very clearly, Jasmine. The gloves are all. The protection I gave the Wellingtons because they were your husband's family, gone. The business deals I steered away from, crushing them completely, over. Patricia Wellington thinks she won by getting her son to divorce you, thinks she finally got rid of the girl who wasn't good enough for her precious boy. But what she doesn't know, what neither of them know, is that they just made an enemy of the most powerful man in this country, and I'm about to teach them a lesson about underestimating a Monroe. His words hung in the air like a promise and a threat, and Jasmine felt something shift inside her, felt the broken pieces of herself starting to rearrange into something new, something harder, something that wouldn't be pushed around or thrown away ever again. And when her father asked her if she wanted revenge, if she wanted to watch the Wellingtons fall, she didn't hesitate before answering yes. Next chapter is where everything explodes, and you do not want to miss what happens when Robert Monroe goes to war. Smash that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and comment below telling me what you think Jasmine's father should do to Damon and Patricia, because what's coming next is absolutely savage. Damon's phone buzzed for the 14th time in an hour, each notification bringing worse news than the last. And he sat in his corner office overlooking the city skyline, wondering when exactly his perfect life had started crumbling into dust around his feet. 3 major investors had pulled out of his latest development projects that morning, citing vague concerns about the company's future stability that made no sense given that Wellington Enterprises had posted record profits last quarter and was positioned for unprecedented growth in the new year. His secretary had quit without notice, leaving a resignation letter that simply said she'd received a better offer. And when he tried to call the headhunter who placed her, he discovered that half his executive team had been contacted by competing firms with salary packages he couldn't possibly match without bankrupting himself. Someone was targeting him, systematically dismantling everything he'd built, and he had no idea who or why until his lawyer called with news that made his blood run cold. If you're watching this, drop a like and comment what you think is happening to Damon, because this chapter is about to show you what real power looks like when it's wielded by someone who actually knows how to use it. Damon, we have a problem. Richard Cheng's voice came through the speaker with a kind of tension that meant whatever came next was going to cost him millions. The Monroe Corporation just bought out 3 of your major creditors and they're calling in your loans, all of them simultaneously. You have 72 hours to pay back approximately $200 million, or they'll start seizing assets, beginning with your downtown properties and the penthouse. The word didn't make sense at first, bouncing off Damon's brain like bullets off steel, because the Monroe Corporation had never shown any interest in his business before, had always stayed in their own lane, dealing with tech and real estate on a scale that made his company look like a lemonade stand by comparison. Why would Monroe Corporation care about Wellington Enterprises? Damon asked, his mind racing through every business dealing he'd had in the past 5 years, searching for some connection he'd missed, some offense he'd committed that would warrant this level of financial assault. We don't compete in the same markets. We've never even crossed paths at industry events. This doesn't make any sense, Richard. But even as Hesse said it, something cold started creeping up his spine. A suspicion so ridiculous, he almost laughed, except that the timing was too perfect, too precise, too deliberately calculated to be coincidence. His lawyer was quiet for a long moment before responding, and when he did, his voice carried a weight that made Damon's hands grip the edge of his desk hard enough to hurt. Damon, I need you to answer a question honestly, and I need you to think very carefully before you respond. Your ex-wife, Jasmine, what was her maiden name? The question seemed to come from nowhere, seemed completely unrelated to the financial crisis unfolding around him. But Damon found himself answering automatically, his brain still trying to connect dots that didn't seem to connect. Monroe, Jasmine Monroe. Why does that matter? She was nobody, just some girl I met at a charity event who had a pretty face and knew how to make me laugh. My mother did a background check, confirmed she came from nothing important, confirmed she was safe to marry, without any messy family entanglements. He heard Richard's sharp intake of breath, heard papers shuffling in the background, and then his lawyer spoke again with a careful tone of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis to a patient who didn't know they were sick. Damon, Jasmine Monroe is Robert Monroe's daughter. Robert Monroe, as in the founder and CEO of Monroe Corporation. Robert Monroe, as in the man who Forbes just named the first black trillionaire in American history. Robert Monroe, as in the most powerful businessman in the country, possibly the world, who apparently just found out that his pregnant daughter was divorced and thrown out of her home by her billionaire husband and his society-climbing mother. The office seemed to tilt sideways as Richard's words sank in, as the implications crashed over Damon like a tsunami, destroying everything in its path. And suddenly, every decision he'd made in the past month looked different, looked catastrophically stupid, looked like the actions of a man who just declared war on a god without realizing he was holding a water pistol instead of a weapon. That's impossible, Damon said, but his voice lacked conviction, because pieces were falling into place now, memories he'd dismissed as unimportant suddenly taking on new significance. The way Jasmine had always been so calm about money, never really caring about the Wellington wealth the way other women did. The education she'd had, the sophisticated way she'd carried herself despite his mother's constant insults about her being uncultured and unrefined. The fact that she'd actually ask him not to have his mother run too deep a background check because she wanted their relationship to be about them, not their families. And he'd been so flattered by that, so convinced she was just a simple girl who'd gotten lucky enough to catch his attention, that he'd agreed without question. It's not impossible, it's fact, Richard continued, his voice green. I just pulled her birth certificate, her school records, everything. Jasmine Monroe attended the most exclusive private schools in the country, has a degree from Harvard Business School that she apparently never mentioned to you, and sits on the board of 3 major corporations under her maiden name. She's not just connected to Monroe wealth, Damon. She's an heiress to an empire that makes your entire net worth look like a rounding error on their quarterly statement. The door to his office burst open without warning, and his mother swept in. Her face, pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, her hands shaking in a way he'd never seen before, because Patricia Wellington didn't shake, didn't show fear, didn't ever look like she'd just seen a ghost. Tell me it's not true, she demanded, her voice rising with each word until she was nearly shouting, all pretense of her usual composure stripped away by whatever news she'd received. Tell me you didn't divorce Robert Monroe's daughter. Tell me I didn't have security throw out a trillionaire's pregnant child like she was common trash. Tell me we didn't just make an enemy of the most powerful man in the country because you couldn't keep your pants zipped around your office assistant. Damon had never heard his mother sound like this, desperate and afraid and looking at him like he'd just burned down everything she'd spent her life building. And the reality of what he'd done started to truly sink in, started to feel real in a way it hadn't when he'd been looking at Jasmine's tear-stained face and feeling nothing but contempt for her perceived weakness. You said she was nobody. He shot back, his own fear translating into anger, because that was easier than admitting he'd been played, manipulated, turned against his own wife by a mother who'd been so obsessed with status and pedigree that she'd failed to recognize real power when he was sleeping in her son's bed every night. You ran the background check. You told me she came from new money, that her family wasn't important, that she was a gold digger trying to trap me. You're the one who pushed me to divorce her, who found Nicole, who planned this whole thing. Patricia's hand flew out and slapped him across the face with enough force to snap his head to the side. The sound echoing in the office like a gunshot, and Damon stared at his mother in shock because she'd never, not once in his entire life, raised a hand to him. I ran a basic background check on Jasmine Monroe, a common name that returned thousands of results, and I picked the one that fit my assumptions. Instead of doing my due diligence, Patricia said, her voice shaking with fury and fear in equal measure. I saw what I wanted to see, a nobody trying to climb above her station. And I missed the fact that Robert Monroe has spent the last 25 years keeping his family out of the public eye, protecting his daughter's privacy so thoroughly that unless you knew exactly where to look and had the right access, you'd never connect her to the Monroe empire. I missed it because I was arrogant. I was stupid. And now we're going to pay for that mistake with everything we have, because Robert Monroe doesn't forgive people who hurt his family, and he has enough money and power to destroy us both without even trying. She sank into the chair across from his desk, suddenly looking every one of her 60 years, her perfectly curved hair and designer clothes unable to hide the fact that she was terrified. He's already started, she continued, pulling out her phone to show him a series of emails and news alerts that made his stomach drop. The country club revoked our membership this morning. The charity boards I sit on asked for my resignation. 3 of my oldest friends won't return my calls. And that's just the social destruction. Damien. Financially, he's going after everything. Every investment, every property, every business relationship we've built over 3 generations. He's not trying to hurt us. He's trying to erase us. And unless we figure out how to fix this, unless we can somehow convince Jasmine to call off her father, we're going to lose. Damien stood and walked to his window, looking out over the city he'd conquered, the empire he'd built, the future he'd planned with Nicole by his side, and realized that none of it mattered. None of it was real, because he'd thrown away the one person who could have made him truly untouchable. And now he was about to learn exactly what it felt like to fall from a height he should never have climbed to in the first place. The wedding is the next chapter, and you absolutely cannot miss what happens when Jasmine walks in. Make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because the final chapter is going to leave you speechless. Comment below if you think Damien deserves what's coming to him. The wedding venue was exactly what Damien and Nicole had wanted. A sprawling luxury hotel ballroom decorated in white and gold with crystal chandeliers catching the afternoon light, and 500 guests dressed in their finest, all carefully selected to witness what was supposed to be Damien Wellington's triumph over his past mistakes and his ascension into a marriage that would solidify his position in high society. Jasmine stood outside the ornate double doors in a dress that had cost more than most people's cars, a deep emerald silk that hugged her now gazelle baby bump and made her dark skin glow like she'd been dipped in gold. Her hair swept up in an elegant style that showed off the diamond earrings her father had given her that morning, along with a simple instruction: show them who you really are. She could hear music playing inside, could hear the murmur of conversation as guests found their seats, could hear Patricia's voice raised in excitement as she greeted someone important, and Jasmine took a deep breath before nodding to Thomas, who stood beside her in his security detail uniform, ready to open those doors and change Damien's life forever. Before you find out what happens next, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a like, because this finale is going to be absolutely insane and you're going to want to watch it again. The invitation had arrived 2 weeks ago, delivered by courier to her father's estate, with a note from Damien that dripped with condescension and cruelty, inviting her to witness what a real marriage looked like, to see what he could have with a woman who actually deserved him. And Jasmine had laughed when she read it, because Damien had no idea that he'd just given her the perfect stage for his destruction. Her father had wanted to simply crush him financially, to take everything and leave him with nothing, but Jasmine had asked for something different, something more personal, and Robert Monroe had never been able to deny his daughter anything she truly wanted. The doors opened, and every head turned towards the entrance, the music stuttering to a stop as the wedding coordinator realized someone had arrived who wasn't on the schedule. And Jasmine walked into that ballroom like she owned it, because technically, as of 3 hours ago, when her father had purchased the hotel, she actually did. She moved down the center aisle with her head held high, her eyes fixed on the altar, where Damien stood frozen in his custom tuxedo, his face cycling through shock, confusion, and dawning horror as he recognized his ex-wife, and beside him, Nicole looked between them with growing panic, because this wasn't part of the plan, wasn't supposed to happen, wasn't supposed to happen, wasn't supposed to happen, wasn't supposed to. But what made Jasmine smile? What made this moment worth every tear she'd cried and every humiliation she'd endured was watching the guests react as they realized who she was, watching the wave of recognition ripple through the crowd as Chicago's elite connected the dots between the woman walking toward them and the Forbes article that had dominated the news cycle for the past month. "That's Robert Monroe's daughter," someone whispered loud enough to carry, and suddenly people were standing, were pulling out their phones, were staring at Jasmine with a kind of respect and fear that came from understanding they were in the presence of true power. Patricia sat in the front row in her mother of the groom glory, her face draining of color as Jasmine passed, and their eyes met for just a second, long enough for Jasmine to see the older woman's world crumbling behind her carefully maintained facade. Jasmine reached the altar and stopped, turning to face the assembled guests with a smile that was all politeness and poison. And when she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of that massive room with perfect clarity. "I want to thank Damien for inviting me to his wedding," Jasmine began, her hand resting on her stomach in a gesture that made several guests gasp, because the implication was impossible to miss, the timeline too obvious to ignore. It's not every day that a woman gets to watch her ex-husband marry his mistress while she's still pregnant with his child. It takes a special kind of man to serve his wife divorce papers on the anniversary, to have his mother throw her out of their home, and then to invite her to witness his happy ending as a form of humiliation. A special kind of man, or perhaps just a spectacularly stupid one. The crowd erupted in whispers. Phones were definitely recording now, and Jasmine could see Damien trying to form words, trying to figure out how to respond. But she wasn't finished, wasn't anywhere close to finished, because she'd spent weeks crafting this speech with her father's legal team, making sure every word was carefully chosen to destroy without crossing into slander. "When I married Damien Wellington 3 years ago, I did it for love. Genuine, real, foolish love. I gave up my position on my family's corporate boards. I stepped away from the Monroe business empire. I distanced myself from the family that actually valued me because my husband and his mother asked me to, because they said it would be better for our marriage if I wasn't connected to my family's wealth and influence. She paused, letting that information sink in, watching as more pieces clicked into place for the assembled guests. I became Jasmine Wellington, and I tried so hard to be the wife Damien wanted, the daughter-in-law Patricia demanded, but nothing I did was ever good enough because they didn't know who I really was, didn't bother to find out, couldn't see past their own arrogance and assumptions to recognize that they were married into one of the most powerful families in the world. Jasmine, please. Damien finally found his voice, stepping toward her with his hands raised like he was approaching a dangerous animal, and the desperation in his eyes would have been satisfying if it wasn't so pathetic, if she couldn't see him calculating even now, trying to figure out how to spin this, how to salvage something from the wreckage of his ambitions. This isn't the time or place for this conversation. Whatever issues we have, we can discuss them privately, work something out that benefits everyone involved, especially our child. He glanced at her stomach, at the visible proof of what he'd thrown away, and Jasmine saw the moment he tried to weaponize her pregnancy, tried to paint himself as the concerned father rather than the man who'd signed away his rights to this baby in the divorce papers his lawyers had drawn up. You're right that I made mistakes, that I listened to bad advice, that I let my mother influence decisions I should have made on my own. But we can fix this, Jasmine. We can go back to how things were, give our baby the family they deserve, build something real this time without all the outside interference. The crowd was eating this up, watching like it was the best reality television they'd ever seen. And several people had their phones pointed directly at the altar, streaming this disaster to social media in real time, where it would be dissected and discussed and turned into memes before the day was over. Nicole had backed away from Damien, her face red with embarrassment and anger, clearly realizing that she'd been used as a pawn in a game much bigger than she'd understood. And Patricia had her head in her hands like she could hide from what was happening, if she just couldn't see it. We can't go back, Damien, because there's nothing to go back to, Jasmine said, her voice gentle now, almost pitying, because she genuinely felt sorry for him in this moment. Sorry that he'd been raised by a woman who taught him that people were disposable and love was conditional and money could fix anything. The man I married doesn't exist anymore, if he ever did. You threw away something real for something fake, and now you're standing at this altar, about to marry a woman you don't love, in front of people who don't actually care about you, trying to salvage a reputation that my father destroyed in approximately 72 hours, because you underestimated the woman who loved you enough to give up an empire for you. She turned to address the crowds directly, her voice strengthening as she delivered the final blow. For those of you who don't know, I'm Jasmine Monroe, daughter of Robert Monroe, an heiress to the Monroe Corporation fortune. The background check Patricia Wellington ran on me 3 years ago. It was so surface level, so lazy, so blinded by her own assumptions about who could and couldn't be worthy of her son, that she completely missed the fact that my family is worth more than everyone in this room combined, including her precious Wellington billions. My father has spent the past month systematically dismantling everything the Wellingtons built, calling in loans, revoking memberships, destroying business relationships. And he did it because they hurt his daughter, because they threw out his grandchild, because they mistook kindness for weakness and privacy for poverty. She paused, letting her words echo in the shocked silence. This hotel, my family owns it as of this month. The country club where Patricia loved to gossip about me. We bought it last week. The investors who pulled out of Damien's projects, they work for Monroe Corporation subsidiaries. Every single thing that's gone wrong in your life for the past month, Damien, every door that's closed, every friend who's abandoned you, every deal that's fallen through. That was my father showing you what real power looks like when wielded by someone who actually earned it instead of inheriting it and coasting on their family name. Jasmine watched Damien's knees actually buckle, watched him grab the altar to keep from falling as the full weight of what she was saying crashed down on him. And then she delivered her final message, the one she'd practiced in the mirror until she could say it without her voice shaking. I'm not here for revenge, Damien. I'm here to set you free from the delusion that you ever had power over me. You can marry Nicole. You can try to rebuild what my father tore down. You can spend the rest of your life wondering what could have been if you just loved me the way I loved you. But you do it knowing that you had a queen and you traded her for a pawn, and that decision cost you everything that actually mattered. She turned and walked back down that aisle with her head high, past the stunned guest, and the recording phones, and the whispered conversations. And just before she reached the doors, she heard Damien's voice break as he called her name one last time, heard him fall to his knees with a sound that echoed in that massive ballroom, heard him start to cry like his heart was breaking, because it probably was, because he'd finally realized what he'd lost and knew he'd never get it back. And Jasmine walked out of that wedding into the sunshine, where her father waited with a car and a future that didn't include the Wellingtons at all. And 6 months later, when she gave birth to a beautiful baby girl surrounded by family who actually loved her, Damien's flowers and apology letters went straight into the trash unanswered, because some mistakes don't deserve forgiveness, and some bridges are better burned than crossed. That's the end of this incredible story. If you made it this far, you're absolutely amazing. Smash that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling me what you thought of Jasmine's revenge. Should she have given Damien another chance, or did he get exactly what he did? Let me know below, and make sure to check out my other stories, because I've got more drama, more revenge, and more satisfying endings coming your way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.